Juneteenth is now officially a federal holiday, and today Governor Ivey announced that Alabama will recognize tomorrow as a state holiday since June 19th falls on a Saturday. So some offices will be closed. Here's a look at a few. Redstone Arsenal will be closed, but gates 8 and 9 will operate as usual. Aaliyah driver's license offices will also be closed statewide. So what exactly is Juneteenth? Our Nixon Norman explains.
Oftentimes, the Emancipation Proclamation and the ending of slavery go hand in hand. It's been said that this is what freed the slaves back in the 1800s. The proclamation was put in place in 1863, but many of the people who were enslaved were not aware of the news until the year 1865, on, you guessed it, June 19th.
He actually signed it in 62, November. Then in 63, I think, early 63, January 63, it became a law. And the people in parts of Texas, pretty much the whole state, was not informed of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation until 2 years, well over 2 years later, in June of 65.
Union General Gordon Granger delivered the news to slaves in Texas. This announcement called for a celebration that would eventually become a federal holiday.
They began to celebrate with joy and happiness because they were no longer enslaved by the South, and they could hopefully live out the American dream.
President Biden signed a bill that establishes June 19th as Juneteenth National Independence Day. This is the first federal holiday that's been established since Martin Luther King Jr. Day back in 1983. Woodruff celebrates this decision, but recognizes that it's long overdue.
It means everything. It's an awareness that should have been known throughout this country all the time that we've been a country.
Juneteenth is just as important as other Independence Days, but not as widely known as some. Recognizing this holiday on a federal level will bring awareness to the history of why people celebrate. Putting the Valley first, Nixon Norman, WZDX News.